Okay, welcome everyone here in Oxford and people online, wherever you're all joining us from. Good afternoon to everyone here, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever everyone else is joining us from. Thank you for taking the time to join us for this second seminar in our joint series together with the Human Development Report Office at UNDP with IIEP at University in the United States, and of course OFI here at the University of Oxford. In this seminar series, viewing multidimensional poverty from many angles, the three institutions have once again joined forces to host a set of exciting talks and papers, and as today reports, that look at innovations and applications in multidimensional poverty measurement, both from an academic point of view and also in the work of international agencies with a policy focus. We have a very special session today because today is also the day that the 2022 Global Multidimensional Poverty Index is officially launched. What we will do today is a twofold agenda. First, we'll give an introduction into the general workings of the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index. For those who are new to this topic, this should be particularly interesting. And then what we'll do is we'll basically travel across the pond to New York and make sure that we all join our colleagues there in the official launch of the Global Multidimensional Poverty Index. Taking place that we're speaking here in Oxford in New York. After that, we'll have some time for discussion with everyone, both in the online audience and also here in the room. So if you have any questions at any point, online folks can put them in the chat or Q&A box if they like. But we should also be able to allow you to unmute later on. And in-person participants here, of course, also very warmly invited to ask their questions directly. I should say that this seminar is being recorded. So whatever you say, either online or here in the room, will be on record. So mind your tongue, and especially here in the room, the mics are quite sensitive. So please keep any whispers and coughs or whatever else to a minimum, so that we don't disturb our online audience. We'll start with just a very brief presentation by myself, Jacob Dirksen from OFI, and my colleague Alexander Fortach, who is the lead coordinator of the Global MPI report from OFI's end. And we're just going to introduce a little bit what the Global MPI is about. Then, as mentioned, join our colleagues in New York for the launch, and then have time for discussion and question and answers. So with that, I'll hand over to Alex to get us started.
Thank you. A warm welcome from me as well. So this part is going to be a bit of a revision for some of you maybe. The basic question, what is the Global MPI? The Global MPI is an internationally comparable index of acute multidimensional poverty. What does that mean? It means that it uses the same dimension indicators, weights, deprivation and poverty cutoffs for all countries included in the Global MPI. And the countries included in the Global MPI amount up to about over 100 countries in all UNDP world regions. So that includes Arab states, East Asia and the Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. And initially, the Global MPI was launched 2010 by OFI and UNDP. It is updated yearly, and one of the main products that come out of it is a joint report by OFI and UNDP. And it uses mostly mixed and DHS as well as national service for its computation. The Global MPI is grounded in scale capability approach. It aligns with the dimension of the Human Development Index. So as you can see here, it has 3 dimensions, 10 indicators. And initially, the indicators and dimension also reflected the Millennium Development Goals. And major revision took place 2018 to align it with the SDG goals that you can see on the left. So I guess, for example, years of schooling and school attendance links to quality of education, SDG 4.
Okay, a few words also, especially for those who are new to this matter, on the method that underlies the global MPI, which is the IIEP method. And I should say that Professor James Foster, who is one of the co-authors on this method, is one of the co-hosts of the seminar series, and is also in this Zoom meeting at the moment. So if there are any questions on the elegant equations and the terribly complicated but also quite cool mathematical properties of the method that underlies the MPI, I will volunteer James to answer all those questions later on. I would otherwise just embarrass myself. But so the basic idea of the MPI and the underlying method is this so-called dual cutoff counting approach. And we've just seen on what Alex has shown, the MPI consists of 10 indicators. And how this dual cutoff method works is that it applies a deprivation cutoff. That's the first cutoff for each of these deprivation indicators, which identifies whether or not a person and every one in that person's household is deprived of a given indicator. And then the second cutoff, and that's where the idea of the dual cutoff comes in, for the critical share of weighted deprivations that then identify someone, a person or household, not only as deprived, but also as multidimensional poor. This whole thing follows the two steps of poverty measurement, which are canonical since Sen's famous 1976 article. First, to identify who is poor by looking at the deprivation profiles and which household or person exceeds a critical share of weighted deprivations. And then using that information on every person or household to aggregate from the household level into population level indices and statistics. The MPI reflects the depth and the breadth of multidimensional poverty at the same time, as it is the multiplicative adjustment of the headcount ratio, which is the simple share of the population that is identified as being multidimensionally poor, with what we call the intensity, the weighted share of deprivations that the poor people experience on average. And then you can see this very simple formula here. MPI, as one of the measures of the IIEP class, is a simple multiplication of H, or the incidence of multidimensional poverty, times A, or the intensity of weighted deprivations that the poor experience. Now, what's the key advantage of this? It goes beyond just looking at the headcount ratios. Many of you will be familiar with monetary poverty measures, perhaps other kinds of deprivation poverty measures that are anchored in the headcount ratio. The MPI adjusts the simple headcount ratio with the intensity, and because it does so, it is sensitive to any decrement or increment of deprivations among the poor. If you just look at the headcount ratio, how many people are poor, for example, you might disincentivize policymakers from doing something for the poorest of the poor, because in order to move that number, in order to change the headcount ratio, you might prioritize those who are closest to the poverty line, so the least poor, in order for them to cross the poverty threshold. By multiplying with the intensity, we basically make sure that the MPI satisfies a version of this monotonicity property, as the literature calls it. Two further advantages that I mentioned here briefly: the MPI and all its associated statistics, many of which we'll see later on today, can be disaggregated by population subgroups, which makes it quite a powerful tool. So we can look at subnational regions, at other population subgroups by age, by ethnicity, for example. And we can also decompose the MPI by indicator in order to show the composition of multidimensional poverty and how that differs across population subgroups. And the two properties that allow this are the so-called subgroup decomposability and dimensional breakdown property. I mentioned these here just so that you have some food for questions for James later on. Now, I mentioned that we have a deprivation cutoff as the first cutoff for each of the 10 indicators that you already saw earlier on the slide that Alex was showing. Here are the three dimensions, again to the left: health, education, and living standards. And then you can see that within the health dimension and the education dimension, we have 2 indicators each, and 6 within the living standards dimension. What you then also see here under the headline cutoff household is deprived if are these so-called deprivation cutoffs, which tell us when a household and every person in that household are considered deprived. In the case of nutrition, the global MPI considers a household as deprived if any person under 70 years of age for whom there's nutritional information is undernourished. And this follows the WHO definitions for body mass index for adults, and stunting and underweight for children under 5. The next indicator, child mortality, looks at households and asks if there's any child under 18 that has died in the household in the 5-year period that precedes the survey. In education, we have years of schooling, which considers whether or not any eligible household member older than 10 years age has completed 6 years of schooling. So anyone older than 10, and they have completed 6 years of education, the household will be non-deprived. Under school attendance, we look at whether or not there's any school-age child in the household, so a child that should be going to school, but isn't currently in school up to the age where they should normally complete class 8. In the living standards dimension, we look at whether or not the household cooks with solid cooking fuel, which is associated with indoor air pollution, for example, and all the health repercussions from that. We look at sanitation and whether or not the household has access to an improved sanitation facility, or we also consider them deprived if they share the sanitation facility. We look at the source of drinking water, and the household is deprived if they don't have an improved source of drinking water or it is too far away. Whether or not the household has electricity in their own house, and the materials of housing. So what is the floor, the roof, or the wall made of? And the final indicator is an asset indicator, so another material deprivation indicator that looks at a set of assets and counts how many of these assets people in the household do own. And if they don't own the critical share that you can see here on the slide, then they would be considered deprived in assets as well. Now, these 10 indicators in the 3 dimensions are weighted, as you can see on this slide. Each of the dimensions receives equal weight. So 1/3 of the weight, which expresses the relative importance of each of these dimensions to multidimensional poverty, are weighted at 1/3. And then within each dimension, each of the indicators are weighted equally, which means 1/6 for all the indicators in the health and education dimension, and 1/18 for all the indicators in the living standards dimension. The poverty cutoff for the global MPI as a measure of acute multidimensional poverty is 1/3. So any household and every person within that household who experience at least 1/3 of the weighted MPI deprivations will be identified as being multidimensionally poor. And then that is the information that we build the headcount ratio and also the intensity of multidimensional poverty from and aggregate it to the MPI. We'll now switch over to Alex again.
Yeah. So before we go to the launch video, we thought it would be quite interesting to give you some additional information and talk about the global MPI 2022 in more specific terms. So the output of the global MPI 2022 are 101 countries for which poverty levels are available. This comprises 6.1 billion people and over 90% of people in lower and middle income countries. It also includes poverty trends or changes over time trends for 84 countries, which comes up to about 5 billion people. And what the Global MPI 2022 really offers is an information platform, or as we like to say, a high resolution lens. So it offers the overall poverty levels and the MPI statistics, as well as it can also be broken down and shows the results of indicator dimension, the contribution to overall poverty, and the decomposition by population groups, geographical areas, and region. It also offers 2 additional poverty lines, one that reflects vulnerability to poverty and the other severe poverty. And then next to the Global MPI Report 2022, which is called Unpacking Deprivation Bundles this year, we also would like to kind of note or highlight that there is more information available. So on the OFI website, there are various data tables which provide the, you can see the thing on the, which basically where you can find all the results, the national results, age results, area results, subnational results, and so on. We also have available on the OFI website individual country trees if you want more specific information on a specific country. And there is also a data bank if you're looking for a bit more visualized results. And then finally, in case you are interested, we also upload our do files for the data prep. So in case you would like to redo some of the analysis or some of the results yourselves and use it, you will also find the do files online. In terms of the global MPI 2022, there are a few constraints that come with a project that is so big as this. One of them are, or like the key ones are data constraints. So the global in the global MPI 2022 estimates, there are several countries that miss at least one indicator. So for example, there are 8 countries that miss information on nutrition, or 4 countries that miss information on cooking fuels. And then, as not unusual in survey data, there are some missing values, and obviously this leads to sample size reduction and then can lead to biases in the results. One major issue that is also picked up by the global MPI 2022 report in more detail is the infrequently and unregularly updating of surveys. So some of the poorest countries have only data that was last collected, or surveys that were last collected in 2012, for example, and also the surveys so far are, for example, not able to reflect the effects of COVID-19 or current crises as a result. And now we switch to the global.
Okay, so we'll now switch over basically to New York, where at the moment the Directorate of OFI, so Sabina Alkaya and HDO colleagues from UNDP are launching the results. And so we'll hop over to New York basically and see what they're up to over there. I'll also say for the online audience, you can see that in the chat, the report has already been kindly shared with you by our colleagues in Washington. So you can take a look at all of these things there. And then we also have quite a few colleagues who have been very centrally involved in the report and all the results that you'll hear presented now, in addition to what Alexandra was just explaining, both here in the room, of course, but also online. So we have a rich pool of experts who will be able to answer any questions that you might have on what we are going to see now.
Let's hear now from the authors of this year's MPI report. Joining us, we have Tasneem Mirza, who is policy specialist at the UNDP's Human Development Report Office, and Sabina Alkaya, director of the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative at Oxford University. Tasneem, if we could start with you, please. What is the global MPI?
So the MPI complements monetary-based measures of poverty to look into the daily deprivation for people experiencing their lives in the areas of health, education, and living standards. So we look at 10 specific indicators. Each of these indicators is binary, so it takes a value of 0 or 1. So for example, a person will be considered deprived in nutrition if someone in their household is underweight, or a person could be considered deprived in electricity if the household does not have access to it. So once we understand the deprivation in each of these indicators, then we give the person a deprivation score. And when the deprivation score is 1 or higher, the person is considered multidimensionally poor. And the way MPI is calculated is it considers not only the share of poor people, but also their average deprivation score. And the index we get from 0 to 1, higher decimals indicating higher. Now, let me share with you what this means in a real person's life. Fania is from Eastern Madagascar. She lives in a small town next to a rainforest and a national park. As you can see, the house that she lives in is built of mud walls. The roof leaks when it rains, and the house does not keep them adequately warm. They do not have access to electricity in the house, For lighting, the family uses kerosene lamp. There's no water access, but they use the nearby streams from the forest. And they also don't have a toilet, so the family uses nearby bush. Now, Fania hasn't had a lot of education. She knows how to read and how to write. Her eldest son dropped out of school in grade 3 and now works in the town as a night guard. Between what she earns breaking rocks and her son, the family doesn't meet the nutritional need with their earnings. So based on what I have just described, Fania is deprived in 9 out of the 10 indicators of the MPI. This gives her a deprivation score of 83%, and she's considered to be severely multidimensionally poor.
Thank you for explaining that so clearly for us, Disney. Now, the title of the 2022 MPI report is Understanding Deprivation Bundles. What does that mean?
So people experience multiple deprivations, and we analyze that in the report. As an example, in Sub-Saharan Africa, if we look at the top 20 profiles, here we see that in this chart we have approximately half of the region covered, and we see that Fania's profile is in fact not that uncommon. It's the third most common profile in Sub-Saharan Africa, where 3.7% of the population have exactly that same profile. And if you look at the most common profile, that's 5.9% of Sub-Saharan Africa, they are deprived in all of the 6 living standard indicators. And this deprivation of in the standards of living across Sub-Saharan Africa is actually quite common if you look across. And now if we compare that to South Asia, we see a very different picture. A poor person is much less likely to be deprived in access to drinking water or electricity compared to a multidimensionally poor person in Sub-Saharan Africa. But in South Asia, if we look at the nutrition, we see that the challenges here has been persistent. It's one of the regions that is home to the largest share of malnourished and stunted children.
So what does this mean then for policy makers? How useful are these deprivation bundles for policymakers?
So in our analysis, we find that deprivations tend to overlap. For example, 50% of the poor are jointly deprived in cooking fuel and electricity. And intervention in energy here will be important. Or 40% of the poor are jointly deprived in drinking water and sanitation. And across the globe, we see a lot of interventions in WASH. So when governments understand these deprivations, they are able to target better. And as Akim mentioned, we saw this in the case of Nepal, where the government wanted to address the issue of malnourishment in children under 5. And the way they did this is they not only invested in nutrition and food security, but they also invested heavily in sanitation, which then improved the quality of drinking water, reduced incidences of diarrhea, and had a large impact on child nutrition and mortality. So when governments are able to see the deprivation and link them, they can make much more effective and smarter intervention.
Thank you very much, Tasneem. Now, Sabina, when are the poor according to this latest MPI?
So the global MPI 2022 covers 6 billion people in 111 countries, and 1.2 billion of them are multidimensionally poor. And of those, sadly, half are children. 1 in 3 children are poor, but 1 in 7 adults. In terms of where they live, 83% are in rural areas, and 83% are also in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But this year, fewer people in South Asia, in part because of the strong reduction, for example, in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, but also because the data are newer. So there may have been changes not yet visible in Africa. These numbers come out, and yet it's important to let them sink in. They should not be what Amartya Sen referred to as a calamity to which the world has somewhat incredibly gotten cruelly accustomed. Rather, especially because they probably underestimate poverty, they must be a challenge for us to address with the sharper tools of deprivation bundles and other kinds of tools.
Can you tell us about poverty reduction trends, Sabina, at least before they were impacted, set back by the COVID pandemic?
Yes, so this year we cover 81 countries and over 5 billion people. And 72 of those countries had a statistically significant reduction in one period. Central Africa and Guinea had an increase. When the Sustainable Development Goals suggest people to step outside institutional silos, it's because sometimes synergistic policies have an impact. And we found that of those 72 countries, 68 reduced deprivations in 5 or more indicators, 46 countries in 8 or more, 26 in all included indicators. So there was evidence that synergistic approaches were of interest, but it's not all good news. So of the 80 countries, we cover 81, and 40, half of them, children either had 0 reduction of poverty or they reduced more slowly than adults, and they are poor. Also, before the pandemic, we had done a simulation at the very beginning showing that probably the pandemic was going to set poverty reduction trends back by 3 to 10 years. The updated data are showing that the setback is likely at the high end of that difficulty.
Sabina, what data was used to compute this latest MPI? How recent is the data?
So we're very grateful to UNICEF with the multiple indicator cluster survey and USAID with the demographic and health surveys that we use for 99 countries, and national data providers and PACFAM we use for 13. And the updated estimates are for 12 countries, half in Latin America plus India. We added 3 new countries, including Samoa and Tuvalu, small islands that would say it's an important group. And of the poor people, although the data go from 2010 to 2021, 83% of poor people have data from 2016 or later, and 37% from 2019 or later. But there's a problem. And the problem is that our data do not represent the post-pandemic situation. The Sustainable Development Goals called for a data revolution. And we hoped that after 2015, that vertical line, we would see a stark increase in the frequency of the household surveys, but we're not seeing that. And just to put a point on it, our 3 poorest countries are Niger, South Sudan, and Burkina Faso. And their data are from 2010 to 2012. And they're home to 50 million poor people. We have data on monetary data on billionaires every hour. And so the report calls for the data revolution not to leave poverty data behind.
Between these data gaps and child poverty, this is painting a really gloomy picture. Is there any cause for hope?
There are many stories that we can pull out. For example, 12 of the 20 countries to reduce multidimensional poverty fastest were in Africa. And there are many countries that had pro-poor's trends. But one that we signal in this report is the experience of India. From 2005-6 to 2019-21, India reduced multidimensional poverty from 55.1% to 16.4%. 415 million people came out of poverty, 275 million in the first decade, 147. And there were pro-poor's trends across social groups and absolute reductions. And so that's a positive setting. All 10 indicators reduced significantly. Cooking, fuel, sanitation, housing were very strong. But again, these data don't reflect the post-pandemic situation. And even then, 229 million people remained poor in India, 97 children. So our hope is that these data and these new tools will be useful, indeed, also in this context.
Dina and Tasneem, thank you very much, both for helping us understand some of the wealth of data in your reports. And now here's a short video summary of more of the main findings of this year's MPI report. To help us digest the findings and better understand the relevance of the MPI, we're joined in the studio again by UNDP Administrator Achim Steiner and OP's Director Sabina Alkaye. And joining us online is Her Excellency Hala Helmi El Sayed, who is Minister of Planning and Economic Development of Egypt. She joins us from Cairo in Egypt. Dr. Luis Felipe Lopez Calva is Global Director of the Poverty and Equity Global Practice of the World Bank Group. He joins us from Washington, D.C. And Her Excellency Amina Satori, who is former Prime Minister of Senegal, joins us from Dhaka in Senegal. Thank you all very much for being here with us. Let's start with a question for everyone. In one sentence, what's the most striking takeaway for you from this year's MPI report? If we could start with you, please, Achim.
Well, perhaps something that is self-evident, but you have to then unbundle it or even bundle it, as the report says, which is that there are many factors that drive poverty and keep people in poverty and even make people fall back into poverty. And it is that which the NPI allows us to recognize much more clearly, that there are ways in which you can develop much more integrated responses and therefore achieve much greater returns on poverty reduction investments.
And Sabrina, what about you as one of the authors of the report?
What surprised me is that if you look at all of the interconnected indicators, you might want a bundle that is prominent, but that there was no magic bundle. There was no one bundle that really took care of everything. So you do have to go country by country, region and group by group. But when you do that, then you can get traction. Then you can see some commonalities and plan some responses.
Minister El Sayed, what about you? What stood out for you in this year's report?
Well, let me start first by congratulating us all on today's launch. And I, of course, acknowledge the role of the Multidimensional Poverty Index in supporting all the objectives of multidimensional poverty in over 100 countries. I'd like to congratulate and thank the OPHI and the UNDP for their commitment. Let me, as you mentioned, the most striking takeaway is the prevalence of poverty. As illustrated, half of the poor worldwide are children under the age of 18. 1 in 3 children, as have been mentioned, lives in poverty compared with 1 in 7 adults. We are definitely aware that the worst crises have greatest impact on young people. However, there are also the ones with the boldest ideas, and they are the ones that drive and create a better society for our future.
Luis Felipe, what stands out most for you?
Thank you. So it's an honor to be part of this panel. I will start saying first that it's important to say that there is an intellectual victory that has to be claimed by UNDP and OFI. I think the fact that we will now work on the idea of poverty and being multidimensional, it's a very important intellectual victory that now comes into better policy. So I want to start by acknowledging that. Second, in terms of the report, I really want to say that, well, this is, as we have said recently, a wake-up call for policymakers around the world. The eradication of poverty is a complex phenomenon in its multidimensionality. So it cannot be achieved while in the short term, for the emergency, cash transfers will play a very important role. That is not enough. We need a coordinated action across different sectors in the state. And for that, these numbers, this report, this approach has already paid off in terms of coordinated action in very concrete examples around the world from which we can learn and continue to strengthen.
Dr. Torre, what is your biggest takeaway?
Well, I'm a very optimistic person, so I was glad to hear that 12 out of the 20 countries who reduced vastly poverty are from Africa, because I think that's always the balance that this report is trying to bring. Being very honest about the situation internationally, but at the same time, showing progress. I think it's very important to show progress. We've been in this business for so long. And I was also sort of a little bit disappointed when we are talking about all the data. Africa has suffered a lot from this lack of data. I was happy to hear the word data revolution, because we have seen progresses in Africa in many parts. At the same time, we are struggling with new challenges that came out of the post-COVID period. So I think we need to sort of see that balance being clearly sort of shown, so we don't look like we are sort of pedaling in the in a vacuum. People are trying to move forward. Countries, I'm talking from where I am in Africa. I mean, we have seen important increase in economic growth, and that brings me to one point that we need to discuss. When we are poor and multidimensionally, that's because most of the time those people don't have cash, they don't have incomes, not civilian income. So we have to tie all the issue we are talking about to economic development, to economic growth. If we don't do that, we are looking at the consequences of a bigger problem, which is the lack of economic prospects for the poorest. And I think it's very important that we see that very much being laid out in the report. The other point I would like also to pinpoint is to say that these people sometimes become poor multidimensionally because of peace issues, conflict issues, impact issues. So that is what we bring into the bigger picture. So when we look at solution, we can also have multi-dimensional solution too. So that protection is something that we really need to work strongly. In positive economic growth, we need, I believe, a new international deal to end poverty. As human beings, the world has the means to end poverty. We do know that. We have to show also that. Sometimes it's also a matter of political will, and that's where UNDP comes in and the United Nations comes in, is to bring all the countries around the table so they can show the money for international development to preserve peace also. So the consequences also of having a huge number of people being multidimensionally poor is also a security issue for everyone. So that ties also the issue of migration. I'm in West Africa, and younger people can want to cross the desert and be directly in Europe. So how are we going to make sure that we build an international solidarity system so we address that? And lastly, poverty is not only about developing countries. We have to look it also into very developed countries. I lived a lot. I mean, I lived for quite some years in the USA. And I did my studies in Europe. I think poor people in those countries need also, advocates, because I think poverty is a human dignity issue. So no matter where you live, and I think it might be even more difficult to bear when you do it in a wealthy environment to be multidimensionally poor. So I think it's good to bring, the poverty issues as we see it in different parts of the world, but let's make sure we bring it as one, and we bring them to human rights issues, whether you're from Nepal, or you're from Senegal, or you're from the USA, or the South of USA, you need to access a minimum standards of health, of education and income. That's what I wanted to say at this point with that.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll stop the stream from New York at this point. The full launch is available later on YouTube. So if you would like to see anything else from the report launch, you can go online to the UNDP YouTube channel and can watch more coverage on that. As Alex mentioned, the report and tables, do files, all of that, as well as the country briefings are online on the OP website as well as on the HJO website. We now have time for discussion with everyone online and everyone here in the room. So if you have any questions, please, here in the room, just raise your hands. Online, please just put whatever you'd like to ask or comment in the Q&A or chat function. And we have Sabina Akaya online, we have James Foster online, we also have two of the key OFI authors, co-authors on the report, Nikolai Supa and Ricardo Nogales online. And Alex, of course, is the coordinator here from OFI for the whole set of the work. So an excellent team of experts who can answer everyone's question and engage in discussion. Anyone here in the room?
Well, I personally would like to hear from Sabina if she has some overview or some thoughts that she would like to present to us after having gone through the session in New York.
Thank you, James. Excellent idea. Sabina.
Thank you so much. You know, I think the thing that I'd like to say is really thank you. In an event like that, you can't really name names, but this work was led by Usha Kanagaratnam, Nikolai Supa, the interlinkages work with Ricardo Nogales, but the entire team of OFI was involved, Alexandro and Sophie coordinating the report, Maya leading on comms, and many of the people in this seminar taking different parts at different times. And so this is very, very much a team effort. So that's, I think, the most important thing I'd like to say is that thank you. And that our hope is that, yeah, that it goes somewhere. But I think it's also the start of a line of research, hopefully for us. And so I'd really be interested in substantive exchanges, though I know we'll have a lot more in-depth talk next week on the interlinkages part in particular. But no, thank you. And hats off, yeah, to the organizer of this seminar for keeping this going.
Thank you, Sabina. And yeah, very, very good and important point. Next week, we'll have another special session that looks much more at these interlinkages and bundles that the report also looks at. And our colleagues, Nikolai Supa and Ricardo Nogales, will be the ones presenting that. So both for the online audience and the in-person audience, much more on that particular subject next week here in the department in Oxford and also online again. Are there any comments or questions online?
So I have a second interjection. When does it start looking like we're going to be able to look back at the pandemic via data? Do we have any sense as to when data are going to come online covering the pandemic period, or is that still up in the air?
Alex, Sabina, Nikolai, Ricardo?
I will pass this question on to Sabina and Nikolai, who are probably more informed in that regard.
I think it's going to be quite slow. I mean, we know in a sense the DHS and NICs that are in the field and upcoming, and they do exist. But in terms of getting a critical mass of countries, not sure. I think next year we will be able to have some post-pandemic, but we don't know if it'll be reflective of other countries post-pandemic. I think what's more immediate are the national MPI updates. And we find that in some of those, poverty has gone up a little bit, and some has gone down. But the changes so far from the countries that have them, which are not the poorest by any means, have not been as drastic. The changes in measured poverty in Costa Rica or in Vietnam or Colombia or Mexico or South Africa. So I think it's a time where we need to both watch the national MPIs that might be updated more often, and then hold out until we get and just keep analyzing the data sets as they come out. But I think it was a big sadness we couldn't do it this year.
Does that answer your question, James?
Sure does.
Perfect. There's another question in the question and answer box. I'm not sure if our other panelists can see this, so I'll just read it. It's by Kanmani Palanisamy, who is asking, at a country level, does the National Family Health Survey, commonly called the NFHS, in India, which measures each of these poverty indicators, carry any weight internationally? Again, Alex, Sabina, other authors.
So
Maybe I'll go at that, but it's the National Family Health Survey, NFHS, is a demographic and health survey. And so when we say that the MPI is computed using the demographic and health survey, until this year, it's been done collaboratively with the DHS office. And so it's considered a DHS outside India and NFHS inside India. So therefore it does carry weight, and the data are considered to be of good quality, or where there are shortcomings, the data report tries to identify those. But this is always something we need to investigate further.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sabina. There's another question in the Q&A by Tawhid Alam. Child labor causes school dropout and should have been included. The asset part should include savings. Any reactions to those suggestions?
Sabina, would you like to react?
No, thank you so much, Tawhid. So child labor for us is very, very important. And what we do is when there are linked child MPIs, and then often they would include child labor. But in the global MPI, we don't have child labor data for a sufficient number of countries. When Ushikana Gratam, Nikolai Supa, and others revised the global MPI with HDRO in 2018, we had a minimum of 75 countries and 3.5 billion people who had to have data in order for something to be considered. And child labor is not available at that scope. So I think what's best is to look at particular data sets and try to learn from it. And similarly, in terms of savings, that the surveys that we use wouldn't have that. But some national MPIs that have a different cut on the data sources certainly do. So it's good to look at, remember that the global MPI is just one expression of a possible measure. And with other data sets, then other indicators can be incorporated that are more appropriate in certain contexts or where the data are at least available.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sabina. Any other questions from the online audience or anyone here in the room?
So I guess I'll be the fount of questions. I thought it was particularly interesting to consider the vulnerable group, the 20%, 33%. And is there anything from that group that we can draw inferences as to what might be happening over the next few years? Because vulnerability, of course, is temporal and describing what could be in the future. So if you could kind of give a little insight as to what the report showed on that, I'd be really interested.
Alex or Sabina?
Sabina, I feel you're most qualified to answer this.
I feel I'm boring everyone to tears. I want some questions for some other people, please. So vulnerability is included in table 6, and we can look at changes over time and analyze them for all countries. But because of the theme this year, it was not profiled. But as Ricardo and Nikolai will show next year, in the work on COVID simulations, one thing that was done was in terms of undernutrition, these deprivations were applied to people who were either poor or vulnerable, but were not at present experiencing nutritional deprivations, because it was anticipated that they were indeed the most vulnerable to have experienced them during the COVID shock. So when we talk about those simulations, we are involving the identification of a vulnerable population in them. I don't know if Ricardo or Nikolai want to say more, but I think you're right, James. I think it would be good, particularly in very low poverty countries, to have a better look at vulnerability, critically to see if the indicators make any sense at all in that context, but also if they do, then rigorously, because those data exist and we can look at them. And I mentioned the point in India where 2/3 of the vulnerable are deprived of nutrition, which is something that I think really needs to be taken into account when we consider the wider picture across India.
And by the way, the same thing applies for income-based poverty measures at this juncture. It seems like that's the time that we should be seeing what's happening. As we all know, that so many of the people who come out of poverty left into the vulnerable group. And with the current, well, the last 3 years, we can expect the return visit.
Brilliant. Thank you, James, for the very pertinent questions, and Sabina for the patient answers. We're very grateful that you joined. We just watched the recording from your interview, so we're very happy that you took the time. There's 2 questions now here in the room, and we'll see if you can hear the folks here, if they just speak from the back of the room. We'll have you first and then yourself, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the amazing science and the great presentation. My question is actually regarding the gender and race perspectives that might also have come from this study. Is there any insight that you that was overwhelmingly stood out for you? Because we heard about children, and it was really interesting, and I would like to know if gender and race also were topics that were mentioned in the study itself. Thank you.
Thank you. So we didn't focus on race and gender this report, but Fanny is in the room and she worked on ethnicity last year, so she could maybe give an update in terms of results last year. If you want to come in, I don't want to put you on the spot. What were the results in terms of race, or in this case, ethnicity?
Sure. I don't know if you can hear me, or do I need to move closer? But okay, so we disaggregated the global MPI last year for 30 countries, or just under 40, using ethnicity data. And there were almost in all countries quite large disparities. Unfortunately, we're not able to extend it to global coverage because the data was not really available, but we saw really big differences, especially in Latin America, between the indigenous communities and non-indigenous groups, but also in some of the sub-Saharan African countries. And we have the report on the website, so maybe we can put that in the chat. And also, I think I will actually be presenting on ethnicity in a different seminar in a few weeks, so we can also share that if you're interested.
And there is a gender household.
Please continue.
For this year's report, they did you a table on the gender of household head analysis for the global MPI.
Thank you, Fanny and Corinne. Next question, please.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk about policy applications of the MPI in terms of, for example, collaborating with governments or specific policy that were implemented based on the findings in the past or during COVID pandemic.
So it is difficult to actually link global MPI results to specific national policies, and so far we haven't, at least to my knowledge, we haven't done so. But yes, Corinne?
Okay, I was going to say, so a bunch of countries have their national multidimensional poverty indexes, which are tailored to their context and priorities, and those are directly used by governments for policy making, for budget allocation, for targeting, for policy evaluation, and for reporting to the SDGs along with the global MPI. So those are the ones that are more often used for policy making. Some countries that don't have a national MPI might use the global measure, but usually they would use a national measure.
Yes, and I would add with the
Just a footnote, Nepal uses the global MPI as a national measure. And so when you heard some of the examples from Nepal, their national and the global measure coincide.
So there is some use in Nepal, for example. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Sabina, but the aspiration of looking at the deprivation bundles is also to inform policy, so that the aspiration is that these can actually show how policy can be targeted or like directed towards addressing certain deprivations.
Thank you. There's another question in the room, but before then, I also just use the power of the chair to give another footnote. So on the question of policy uses, the website, both the OP website and the website of the Multidimensional Poverty Peer Network, which is a South-South network where many of the countries that are currently or have already developed these national multidimensional poverty indices interact, has a rich array of resources on specific policy uses, including budgeting, targeting, coordination, all kinds of things that MPIs have already been used for. So if you're interested in any particular country or specific applications, I'd invite you to also take a look at the website of the NPPN and explore that further. We'll also have a few other presentations later on in the series that will look at some policy applications or analysis that can inform policy in a bit more detail. But yeah, we have another question here, so please.
Yeah, I mean, talking of the revolution on data or the world revolution on data, or essentially the lack of data. I mean, I think also the pandemic has shown in a lot of the richest Western countries that data collection on a population level is not good, would be a euphemism for some countries. So, and you having data or relying on data for like that was published 10 years ago, which means it was even assessed before that. When is there, is there something happening at UN or higher education or higher university levels to really try to get into more data driven, like try to get the data then at some point? Because like, is there a new thrust, or is it just the modeling through until, I don't know, there is some data for 2020 published in 2030 or something?
Sabina, would you like to answer this?
Sure. First of all, when we say 2010, that's the year the data were fielded. The field work happened and the data were collected. And so they would be released subsequent to that. But that is the data fielding. Second, in terms of a global forum, there is the World Data Forum that was launched, and the UN Statistics Division is the secretariat for it. And it has a leadership group, and it's had different meetings. And the Cape Town Global Forum gave a call for improved household surveys. But the subsequent data forums, in a sense, have focused primarily on big data, cell phone data, private sector data, and haven't perhaps focused on household surveys, nor on trying to garner the resources. So if you think of the mix, there's not a huge funding pot. They have to find funding for the surveys at each country. And similarly for DHS, there's a more of a funding crisis now than there has been in the past. And so I think if this is a priority, then unfortunately funding is a central priority to move it back. And in some countries, there's also a data environment that's not open to having these surveys collected. But in most, actually, the ones that I know, there's interest, but the bottleneck is money.
Thank you, Sabina, and thank you for the questions. I think we're already a bit over time, so I'd like to thank all our speakers from the launch that we watched in New York, as well as my colleague Alex and my colleagues Corinne and Fanny here in the room for answering the questions, and everyone online and here in person who participated and took the time to join us today, as well as a big thank you to our colleagues in Washington who are hosting the IT infrastructure here with us, and James Foster as the co-host together with Sabina and our colleagues at HAO of the entire series. Next week, as we heard, there's going to be a close-up look on the bundles and interlinkages in MPI indicators, which very often also, as we saw, capture information related to several SDGs. And our colleagues Nicolai Suppa and Ricardo Nogales will be presenting at the same time in the department and via Zoom. The recording link has, I believe, been posted in the chat for those who are interested, and then the report is also available online alongside with all the other global MPI materials that were mentioned during the presentation today. So with that, thank you all for taking the time to joining us, and we hope to see you again next week.